It's 7 o'clock in Argentina, 7 p.m. It's 3 p.m. in Arizona. And Zaheer, are you ready? Chris, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome to the webinar, The Human Exploration of Space. I am Ricardo Vanella, your host today. I want to send my grateful greetings to Ana Prieto, our scientific advisor, to Chino Mans, our designer, to Adrian Fornasari, our event operator today, to Doug Branke, president of Global Chamber, to our, of course, distinguished speakers, and to all those who made this webinar possible. And above all, thank you so much to all of you, the attendees. Indeed, we have a very interesting audience in terms of quantity, quality, and diversity. People from 18 countries registered. However, let's assume for a moment that we are all Earth residents, and consequently, we have a lot of things in common, and we actually feel united. That's the spirit of this meeting. The human exploration of space is a huge subject, which is like a giant tree with many branches, leaves, and roots. And each of these elements constitutes a specialty by itself, all of them demanding a specific, precise expertise. Please consider today's meeting as a general flyover. Maybe we could have more webinars like this in the future. Now, let me share with you some basic rules for today's event. This webinar is organized in 3 segments of 30 minutes each, as follows. In the first segment, the speakers will talk some general tips for context I will formulate. In the second segment, speakers will answer some specific questions that I'm going to ask them. The third segment is for questions and answers itself. The speakers will answer the questions that the audience wrote during the webinar in the specific space that this platform provides. Please look the toolbar at the bottom of your screens. So please, to the audience, don't raise your hand during the event. Just write your questions during the first hour of the event so that in the last segment, we'll read them separately or aggregated, and the speakers will answer as many questions as time allows. And now the most important. We are gathered at this time of today essentially to listen and then ask a few questions to 2 outstanding speakers who have the genuine expertise to deliver about these topics. You have a lot of information about them on the internet, of course, but let me enjoy the high privilege of introducing them, at least briefly. Please, Christopher Impey, raise your hand. On one hand, we have Professor Christopher Impey. Professor Impey is an astronomer, educator, and author. He is a university distinguished professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona. He has over 220 refereed publications. His research receives support and relevant grants from top institutions like NASA, the National Science Foundation, and others. He won important awards, wrote many articles, many books, among them one upcoming book on exoplanets, Worlds Without End, and so on. He participates in the leadership of important projects and institutions, and also serves on the advisory council of MEDI, Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence. I would say that Chris Impey is an accomplished artist of the research and transmission of scientific knowledge in his realm. On the other hand, and please, Zaheer, raise your hand, we have Professor Zaheer Ali. Zaheer is a space innovator, an agilist, expert on space technology and policy. He's now a managing partner at New Space Finance, professor of practice at Thunderbird School of Global Management, and director of high performance computing at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, amongst other activities. He's also an advisor to multiple space startups. Among the various relevant activities he carries out, he previously served as a senior manager at the university's Space Research Association in top projects, for example, with NASA as the Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy, the famous SOFIA, among others. Zaheer covers a very wide variety of specialties indeed. To better understand Zaheer, you have to imagine a very peculiar mix of engineer, scientific inventor, entrepreneur, manager, technologist, teacher, writer, and futurist. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you that today we have two deluxe speakers. Chris, Zaheer, thank you so much for being here with us today. Now I'm going to provide some questions, some thoughts. We all more or less wonder what are the benefits that human exploration of space can concretely bring to humanity. What is the current state of human exploration of space? What is the estimated agenda of such initiative? Of the steps that are currently being taken. What developments do you foresee for the immediate future? From now to the next 3-5 years. For the medium term, 10 years, and a projection of the plausible scenarios you foresee in the long term. Now, I invite Chris to take the word, to illuminate us. Chris, please.
Okay, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here with you both and with our audience. Anyone who hadn't been reading the news for a few years could be forgiven for thinking the space activity involving humans is in the doldrums or hasn't got very far. 80% of the world's population was not alive when we last set foot on the moon. There was over a decade, when America could not launch its own astronauts into Earth orbit. NASA's budget is actually now 2 times lower than it was 30 years ago in real terms. That's not a recipe for wonderful things happening in space. And yet, in 2016, with the resurgence of a private sector in space, there were more commercial launches to Earth orbit than government launches for the first time. In last year, there were more successful launches to Earth orbit than any year since Sputnik. There were more people in space simultaneously than any time ever, 21. We had the youngest astronaut, Oliver Damon, the oldest astronaut, William Shatner. All sorts of records were broken last year. And so I can say confidently, it's not just the froth of the newspaper headlines who like to hyperventilate on Elon Musk and somewhat less on Jeff Bezos. Something very exciting is happening. And if I were analogizing it, I would analogize it imperfectly to 1995, which is the year the internet went from being something that happened in government labs and a small number of businesses and agencies was unknown to the average person. In 1995, Amazon was founded. 2 Stanford grad students just figured out search, and the first internet service providers came into being. And I challenge anyone to look back on that few decades of the internet and predict where we would be today. $3 trillion economy, part of the world's economy. I don't want to push it too hard, but I think this time we're living in is an analog of 1995 for the internet. It's the time when it moves from the government sector, from the pure research sector to the private sector with commercial motivations. and we're just seeing it happening all around us. It's very hard to say where that is going to take us. I've already said that it's impossible to predict. But we know that this activity is going to grow. The number of people who've been in Earth orbit is 10 times or 12 times fewer than those who've set foot on Mount Everest. It's a very small number of people, less than 700. So it is still a small activity. It's still extremely expensive. The critiques that we hear are valid. Billionaires with boy toys, why should I care? It's so expensive, it'll never be for me. Why are we doing things up there when we have so many problems on the home planet? It's being done by rich, mostly Caucasian people, and maybe we're going to replay the horrible colonial episodes when we migrated across the planet and ignored the people that were already in those places. Maybe space is going to be another place where there are no rules, no ethical boundaries. So those are the critiques, and they're valid. They have to be addressed. And now's the time actually to think deeply about them. And I hope there's some questions about this. But I'm a positive thinker about space. I find it very exciting. I would go if I had the chance, and it costs less than it costs now. And I think in 3 to 5 years, we'll see the cementing of the commercial sector generating revenues for the first time, significant revenues from tourism and from activities that they're already doing. Elon Musk has a revenue stream just from supplying the space station, working with NASA. But the purely commercial activity will take off. And from there, you're riding a linear path towards commercial activities on the moon, mining asteroids, a space elevator, probably on the moon initially. It's too hard to do on the Earth for quite a while. And off Earth for the first time. If humans move off Earth, it will be as dramatic as the time we set foot out of Africa 50,000 years ago. The first person to be born off Earth will be a dramatic event, and we're going to see that in our lifetimes. We're going to see that probably in a few years. Will it be for good or for ill? Is there a strong positive reason to be out there? We're writing the history as we live it. You know, we're writing the reasons to be out there. There's a pure urge to explore, to go to new places, to expand the experiment of humanity, possibly to new locations. That could be a positive thing. And hopefully we'll be mindful of the things that are the downsides of this activity. Carbon footprint of space travel is actually quite horrible. It is indeed not a demographic that favors the average person at the moment. So we have to sort of be patient and wait for it to develop and to mature. People will die. It'll follow the arc of commercial travel, which was for the very rich and was fairly dangerous and difficult to do in the 1930s. And now 4 billion passenger miles are flown effortlessly without people thinking about it, and you don't worry about being on a plane. It's far more dangerous to drive. So space travel hopefully will follow that arc too. So those are just a few thoughts. I won't go on anymore about the very exciting nonlinear progression that we find ourselves in now that you see in the newspaper headlines pretty much every week. And it is hard to predict, but actually that's one of the exciting things about it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chris. It is very promising indeed and challenging. Zaheer, your turn.
Well, thank you, Ricardo. And thank you, Professor Impey. It's an honor to be with both of you here today. You know, it's funny because I've actually read one of your books, Chris. So it was like, oh, that's pretty cool to be on, you know, and I really appreciate how much you've done in terms of making so much of this thinking accessible to so many people via very lucid books. You know, Vonnegut and Irving and Steinbeck always would hit back at critics and say, our writing is easy to read because of how hard we work at it. It's easy to be convoluted. So, you know, I recommend Professor Impey's books to anybody who's interested in jumpstarting their understanding of space. You know, my perspective on space, having been kind of in the weeds, you know, hands on microboards, and not necessarily on console for satellite operations, but certainly, you know, driving operations with my needs, coming from a background of of a lot of different types of usage of space, everything from Earth system science to counterterrorism and nuclear non-proliferation. You know, the reality is that most of the people on this call used a space asset 10 times before they had their first cup of coffee. So I just want you to think about the reality that space is already part of your life. Things that, you know, Chris, you mentioned 80% of the world's population has been born after the last time we set foot on the moon. What I think is also amazing is 90% of people under 30 don't remember a world without GPS capability to help them not be lost. That is a direct consequence of what space can do for you. Think of the trillions of dollars of economic value, millions of jobs, and you know the massive value to humanity that geolocation has given us. A great book on that is Never Lost Again by the by I think employee number 2, maybe number 3. It's John Hankey's college buddy who became his chief marketing officer at Keyhole Technologies. Keyhole, you people, folks in the audience probably know better as Google Earth. That's why the language for all the maps is KML, Keyhole Markup Language. It's a great book to read. So when we talk about what can space do for humanity, the benefits are massive. The opportunities are massive. What we need to focus on is execution, finance, and equity, in my opinion. What do I mean by execution, right? You know, Chris mentioned 2016. 2016 was a very important year because it demonstrated that the cost of launch can be brought down by a factor of 10. Why is space booming now? Very simply, tech billionaires have thrown their risk tolerance, the same one that they brought from Silicon Valley. You know, failure is an option. Okay, failure is an option. This is different from Gene Kranz standing in the control room during Apollo 13 and telling people that they don't have a choice but to make this work. This is different. Failure is an option. In fact, intelligent failure is very valuable. That's one of the key lessons learned in the last 50 years out of Silicon Valley. And that mentality, that attitude was brought to space, brought to bear. And as Charlie Bolden told me, look, Z, Charlie Bolden, former administrator of NASA, if I had blown up as many rockets as Elon, I would have been hauled in front of Congress every week. But the private sector can take those risks. And as long as there's vision and a profit and loss sheet at the end of it that makes sense, they can walk the path. And that's what we've seen happen. So now we're unlocking the ability to go do space in a lot of different ways. And we're also reducing the cost to, not just the cost to get there, but the cost to do stuff there. Because when getting there is so much cheaper, you don't have to engineer what you're putting up there to the level of Hubble or James Webb, right? High schoolers have launched CubeSats, and that's okay. That's great. It's better than okay. So when you think about the current state of where we are, right? Launch costs have come down a tremendous amount. We're really figuring out use cases for what we can do from up there, and we need to apply our imagination, because more is possible now simply because the dollar value to get there and the dollar value to make something to do stuff up there has just drastically gone down. So you know, I love that Chris brought up the idea of the internet. I tell people in my workshops, I'm doing a space executive education coming up just in the second week in November. And one of my themes is it's time to party like it's 1999. And I don't say that just because I love Prince, but in 1999, we were on the cusp of everything going crazy. We were also on the cusp of a drawback, right? Both things are going to happen here soon. There will be a drawback. There's going to be a little bit of a bubble crowd, you know, that's going to burst, but really in the launch economy, because there are too many people there. They're doing the same things. There's going to be consolidation. There's going to be mergers and acquisitions, vertical and horizontal integration. We know this playbook exists. Nobody should be surprised if you can read a history book. But what it's going to do is it's going to separate the grown-ups from the kiddies, first of all, which is very good. It's like a fever for the community. And when you survive it, you're stronger and healthier at the back end, right? But what it's also time to imagine the possibilities. The people who invested in Amazon in 1999 are on yachts right now in the Bahamas or something, right? They're not watching this webinar. They're sipping daiquiris, on a boat somewhere, right? Because they're not worried about money anymore. So there's this tremendous, gigantic, massive opportunity available here. That we're going to have to we're going to have to take advantage of. And so don't jump into what everybody's already doing. The key is to think about what's next. So I talk a lot. One of the other things I tell people is to center yourself on orbit. Don't start on Earth. You need to take your mind and stop thinking like an Earthling. You need to think of yourself sitting on orbit. What can I do looking down? What can I do looking horizontal? What can I do looking up and out to the next thing? So there are fundamental challenges that we also need to address to make a lot of this possible. But in terms of where we are right now, right, we can get to Leo anytime we want. We can pretty much get to the moon anytime we want. We just have chosen not to exactly yet because we want to, it's still expensive enough that we want to have a really good reason. We know we're going to be able to get to Mars. And now it's a matter of what do we do with all this capability of going places, right? The logistics are being solved. Now it's the time of of those who can execute upon arrival. Thinking about what the timeline for this is really, that's crystal ball. I agree with Chris. I think we're going to see some major milestones within our lifetimes. In the next 3 to 5 years in particular, I think is the time of Earth observation and unlocking everything we can do with that, whether it's predicting the price of oil or whether it's jumping into energy sustainability and environmentalism. And then moving farther out, the 5 to 10 year is really when we're going to start seeing resource capture happening. And you can see the politics around that already taking place, with China and directed economies in particular making grabs. So there are certain things you want to think about, but fundamentally, you got to think post-launch. You got to think, what are you going to do in orbit in the short term? And then what are you going to do in cislunar space moving forward from there? So I'll stop there and jump and toss it back to Ricardo.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask you a question. Let's say this question is addressed to Chris. What kind of activities are to be carried out within the framework of human exploration of space from a scientific, technological, economic, and commercial points of view? Can you name them? Can you list some of them?
Some of them are extensions of what we've been doing with the space station for 20 plus years, which is just demonstrating the ability to work and live in space. And that's been done very comprehensively. It's not exotic work. Most of the astronauts spend a lot of time as electricians and plumbers, but it's important demonstration. So we will extend that substantially to the point of having communities and mini societies operating in space. It's a challenging environment, of course, a closed environment. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I'm going to key off something Zaheer said about thinking you're shifting your perspective to Earth orbit. People sort of forget that almost half the energy cost of getting to Mars is just the first 300 miles to Earth orbit. So once you're in Earth orbit, you've half cracked the problem of getting around the solar system. So I think we are going to have the solar system as our oyster, so to speak. And so this will be a decades-long business, but we will start to explore, even to the outer planets. It'll take decades, but it'll be done. And Mars, of course, the solar system. And that will be an enormous expansion of our footprint. We will also use the Earth orbit, as Zaheer alluded to, as the basis for very different kinds of manufacturing, for 3D printing, for biotech and various other things. So done in a less constrained environment than happens on Earth with gravity and with a sort of a very pristine environment, in fact, by definition. So that will happen. And for scientists and astronomers like myself, again, Earth orbit is a great, it's a great starting point. Earth orbit is actually a moderately shitty place to put a telescope. Hubble Space Telescope was not in a perfect orbit. James Webb is in a much nicer place for a telescope. But the best place of all is the dark side of the moon. So I think we're going to have a telescope, a whole set of observatories in the dark side of the moon for optical, radio, infrared, everything. It's the perfect place for an observatory. So that'll be the mega observatory of the mid future. And I'm looking forward to that. I hope I live to see that. Well, there are just three examples.
Well, they are huge examples. The following question is for Zaheer. What impacts could human exploration of space can expect on mankind from the economic, social, and geopolitical points of view?
Yeah, I'll work that backwards because I think Chris did a great job in jumping into some of the technological ideas. The impacts geopolitically are already being seen. And what do I mean by that? Right now, between high-tech renewables and space technologies, we are very quickly consuming what we right now call rare earth metals. We might just call them rare metals in general as we move off Earth, because that might get a little bit of become a clunky phase. Right? What are we going to call them? Rare lunar, rare Martian metals? Not quite so good, right? So we'll call them rare metals. But I'm talking about things like platinum, nickel, cobalt, and a whole host of stuff we don't think about on a daily basis. But there's tremendous amounts of it in the Tesla sitting outside in my driveway, or in the mega-sized windmill that is sitting off the coast of Germany and Scotland, and they're going to build off the coast of New Jersey here in the U.S. soon. So we're going to be, and this is a very different discussion than fossil fuels, fundamentally, because it's not necessarily about just running out. It's about where it is. The directed economies have control of 80% of these resources right now. That ratio, which means we're dependent upon our adversaries in the free economies of the world and the democratic nations of the world for these resources. That is going to be an untenable situation. Throughout history, you go read Jared Diamond or any of these other guys, right? The number one cause of conflict in humanity is the scarcity of resources. It defines so much, whether it's land, water, mates, whatever. Scarcity of resources defines human conflict, or the perception of scarcity of resource, right? Think of De Beers and diamonds. Why is there such a thing as a blood diamond? Because De Beers is a cartel. If you buy a diamond, you're supporting slave labor and horrible treatment of humans. It's that simple because of what the cartel does. It's a false scarcity, but it's an effective one. Space represents an opportunity for the first time in human history to move to a post-scarcity society. And the different nations, and in particular, the different political systems, are already jockeying for position in regards to that. Do not think that the Russian ASAT test was an accident. That was not simply saber rattling. That also has economic implications. The Chinese laser and cyber attacks on satellites are a direct statement about their positioning. And so as we move forward, the impact on Earth is going to be a great power conflict for space. There's a spectacular book written by friends and colleagues, Namrata Goswami and Peter Gerritsen, called Scramble for the Skies, if you want to know more about this. But this is going to define the rest of this century in terms of the way we think about it. there's all types of great stuff that space can do for us. But as free people in the free economies of the world, we have to, and our governments have to do the right things to ensure that we don't carry the same mistakes and same problems out into space that we've had throughout human history. Thankfully, we haven't found any little green men out there that we're going to make into slave labor. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we protect ourselves and protect the general world's access to what will fundamentally represent a complete change in our economic view of metal resources, so that there's equity across the world for all peoples. And so this is something that I'm mentally very focused on. It's going to really impact the way we do things politically on Earth, and it's going to impact the way our militaries operate. It's going to impact the way our taxes are structured. It's going to be critical throughout. It's going to pervade your life at some level. So I'll stop there.
So Chris, this is a big question and a very basic one. Who will be the owner of something discovered, something new, or something that they picked up, they just taken, they just took? Who is going to be the owner?
Anyone who wants to be. So space law is very much running behind the activity itself. There have only been 2 UN treaties that speak to space: the Outer Space Treaty of 1965, which banned nukes in space, which is a good thing, signed by most of the world's countries. And then the Moon Treaty of 1979, which dealt with the ownership issue, but only for governments, not for commercial or private entities. So it's a Wild West, literally. And we've already seen, miniaturized examples of that, of private companies planning to turn the Apollo landing sites into a little theme park, and NASA sort of, administrators sort of, their hair goes white thinking of the sacred footprints of the astronauts being trammeled by a little rover or turned into a theme park. But the truth is, it is a Wild West. The regulatory environment is very loose. The American government, going back many administrations, just deliberately decided not to smother the activity in red tape, and we're witnessing the benefit of that now. On the other hand, the international body like the UN are glacially slow, even though they have a working committee on outer space issues that produces white papers and documents and tries to get things moving. Nothing substantial has happened. And so we see the downside of that. We see the real risk in that. At the geopolitical level, it's, as Zaheer said, we're in a new space race, and it's not with the Russians. They're kind of poor and getting poorer second world country. It's with China, whose space program was growing with the rate of their economy for 2 decades. That's a doubling every 5 years compared to NASA's shrinking budget. The average age of their space technology workers is about 28, 29. NASA's civil service employees are in their upper 50s. So it's a young, vibrant activity that's melted into the political military complex. So we don't even know everything they're planning. So those geopolitical rivalries will start to get very intense because it's an arena for competition, and China's not putting many of their cards on the table, but the cards they are putting on the table is, we want to compete and we want to be the best, and we will want to own it if we can. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, of course, is that the incentive on the private sector is just that lack of regulation. I mean, people speculate loosely that the world's first trillionaire will be an asteroid miner. And that's probably after a bunch of people have lost their shirts, but that's the history of resource development in the early pioneering phase anyway. So this is how it's going to go down. And I think it's rather dull to try and overlay a regulatory framework and international law on an activity that's growing rapidly. But some of it's going to have to be done, because Zaheer said jokingly that there are no little green men, out there. We don't think that we'll be able to turn into slave labor. But the ugly flip side of that, of course, is that there's no labor law in space. And so we could have evil empire type commercial entities essentially running slaves in space, and there will be nothing to do with it, no recourse. we've got the tragedy of the commons of space junk, which is another way where regulatory frameworks are lax and there's no self-interest for people pioneering that activity to throw less and less, to decrease the rate of throwing things into low Earth orbit to the point where it gets spoiled for everyone. That's really on the horizon. That's a possibility. That's one of the biggest ominous marks over the whole activity of near Earth. So there are these warning signs. There's some orange flashing warning signs, things we need to do that we're not doing, things that are already a problem that we need to take care of. And I think the main players, at least now, are aware of it. Nobody denies the issue of space junk and the exponential thing that leads to Kessler scenario where it sort of turns it into an unusable part of space. So awareness is the first step, but I think the excitement, the sort of euphoria of what's happening in the private space sector should be modulated by a deeper awareness that we have some business to take care of for it to be good for everyone.
Well, I have the feeling that perhaps humanity is going to repeat itself.
History echoes, right?
Yeah.
You know, or rhymes. I forget. I always want to ascribe such things to Mark Twain, but it might be somebody else. But you know, somebody said history doesn't rhyme, but it often echoes, and I think, you know, you see that, right? You know, another analogy that's really useful to think about space, and in particular think about kind of what kind of rules would apply, and what the authority would be, is really, you know, what Chris alluded to, is the American West, and particularly in the gold rush days. Like, I don't know if you know, how many of our viewers are familiar with Jack London, who famously wrote about the gold rush in Alaska. You know, one of the things in White Fang that is shown is that people try to jump the main character's claim, right? And there are really great songs written about things like that. Or if you ever watched the TV show Deadwood, I've never watched it, but I understand that it's a pretty interesting depiction of that era. And so you're going to have kind of a free-for-all at some level. What's going to happen at some point, though, is what always happens. Think of the Dutch East India Company, or even more recently, British Petroleum in Iran, when the CIA and MI6 overthrew a democratically elected official and installed the Shah to protect, you know, British Petroleum's oil interests in the region, right? You're going to have major companies that represent huge amounts of jobs, GDP, et cetera, go to their governments and say, you need to protect us. We're paying taxes. We're paying taxes. You got to protect our interests. That is the reason you exist, which is a fair statement. For government, for the people, by the people, right? And if you think about the you know, the U.S. Navy, for example, is always deployed, and you know, the other, you know, within the G8, you know, the other major countries with defense budgets who have navies, they're always deployed. Why is the Navy always deployed? They protect shipping lanes, right? They protect our ability to conduct trade around the world via the primary medium of moving goods, which is still cargo on water. So the Space Force, which is out of the Air Force right now, you can see it morph, you could imagine it morphing into a version of the Navy in space. You know, not quite Starfleet and Captain Kirk and, you know, worlds that no human has ever, you know, seen before or anything like that. But very simply, traffic cop and resource cop, right? That's what the Dutch East India Company did for 400 years, and was the basis of the British Empire and their world dominant power. They protected the ability for Britain to make money. So you're going to see that type of thing evolve, right? The thing is, it's going to be messy, because while the Western economies will say, we're going to protect your business interests against bad behavior, but otherwise we're going to be hands off, you have other governments who are not such, whose companies can trace ownership to major, you know, when you trace their capital, it's directly out of government budgets. Those governments are going to get in there and play dirty. And so there's this is going to come to a major conflict at some point. It's going to come to a standoff. It's going to come to a Cuban Missile Crisis type situation, but it's not going to be kinetic necessarily, meaning things blowing up and bullets going bang bang. What it's going to be is it's going to be maneuvers. It's going to be much more like playing Risk or Monopoly, right? You do this tit for tat, counter. I'm a fencer, swords and all that, right? So it's a parry repost with a parry repost on top of that, and it's going to be messy. But fundamentally, right, you're going to have different treaties like the Artemis Accords, which Mike Gold and NASA created, and we have 21 countries signed on to, right? The US is unilaterally making bilateral agreements with all these countries to try to create a normalized order. And if certain countries don't sign on, like other economic orders, they're going to end up isolated. Now, this will cause problems in some way, but it's also one way to say, at least within this community, we play by rules. And if you're going to mess with this community, you're not just messing with one nation, you're messing with 50 significant nations with the power to do things in space. So there's a lot of fun ways to look at it. Go read The Man Who Sold the Moon by Robert Heinlein. It's a highly entertaining, view of this. But at the same time, the realistic view is that it's going to be a hyper acceleration of a lot of the processes that happened in the American West. And it's going to eventually come to one community versus some, actors out there who don't want to play by the rules that the community is playing with. And how do we control those actors from messing the rest of us up too badly?
And Chris, what kind of tools do we currently have or could have to shape consensus, a certain consensus about the organization and rules that should govern the human exploration of space?
We don't have adequate tools because, as we know, that we've watched for a good half century for the limitations of the United Nations from being able to work with any kind of unanimity. And we know also that within that the elite body, which we could just imagine parallelized to the major space powers like the Security Council, there's a veto. So that's essentially a recipe for nothing happening. And Zaheer outlined it very clearly, and we see it happening on Earth. The alignment of Russia and China, for reasons that they're doing it on Earth, maps perfectly into space to have a competing bloc for the Western against the Western world in the Artemis grouping or whatever grouping. And also, just as another point, we can, it's not as commented on, the American media is very US centric, of course, but the number of international players in space has been growing steadily, and partly that's a representation of their national aspirations and the fact that it's a prestige project to be in space if it's not ridiculously expensive. But it's also an awareness that they know where it's headed and they don't want to be left out. So we see, very vigorous and multifaceted space programs emerging in India, in Brazil. Japan's always had one. So the number of, it's the 15 or more countries now that are serious players in space, half of which were not 10 years ago. And that trend will continue. To those that can afford to do it, will do it. They want a seat at the table. But the big boys will, again, always dominate because they're the ones with the militaries of any significant size, which means they can project their police force into space. So if you're worried about the enforcement and you don't have any international law that's governing the activity, then you're really left with a tricky situation.
Well, I think that I am understanding that their institutions, multilateral institutions are not perhaps at the height of what happens in space, for the time being at least, and that worries a little bit. But we have it. We've been talking about Wild West and there's no rules of Earth, and so considering that for the time being, there is not enough evidence to rule out some potential kind of encounter with non-Earth beings during the human exploration of space. Let's assume for a second such a scenario. And what do you think, Zaheer? Is there currently any formal instance in our planet of at least a minimum coordinated analysis design of exopolitics, exodiplomacy, at least as part of a contingency plan? I don't think, I mean, to be honest, I don't think SpaceX or Blue Origins or NASA or whoever is going to plan to build something on the moon without a contingency plan. So what about, is there any currently formal instance about what to do if we meet somebody there?
So there are protocols. I know that sounds crazy, but I mean, when NASA first was sending people up, we had no idea what the heck was really, you know, I mean, yeah, you understand physics, you understand the speed of light and all those things, but there was a today there's a non-zero probability, right? You know, I'm not saying it's a high one, it's a very low one, but it's a non-zero probability that such a thing could happen. You know, what's far more likely is that we find some goofy lichen or something, you know, growing on in Europa or Titan, right? That's, you know, something very, very low level, or something with a few amino acids that's like a protocell. That's far more likely, right? Than encountering a person. But the sheer presence of life that's not from Earth will redefine our thinking about ourselves societally. So I'll be honest, I actually hope it's a commercial private mission that finds such a thing and not NASA or the government, because I expect that the government will want to control that information in different ways. And there will be a lot of debate about whether we release that to the public, whether we do this or that, or a lot of different things. So you know, there have been protocols throughout the years. Most of them revolve around try not to screw it up and get it to a government official, and then they'll probably classify it, and nobody will talk about it, you know, until you know, somebody in the government, you know, like a president or a prime minister, decides what to do with it. But fundamentally, you know, it's not something that most of us, I think, in the space community spend a lot of time thinking about. We leave that to SETI and other organizations who are focused on that type of thinking and that type of search. Most of us are focused on, you know, let's go generate value for humans on Earth by being in space.
So Chris,
I'll toss that over to you, back to you or Chris. Yeah.
Yeah, what are your thoughts? I mean, in case of an eventual encounter, I mean,
Yeah.
who would talk?
This is an area where I kind of glad that you know, sensible and sometimes boring government agencies are handling it. You know, NASA, to its credit, has, you know, long before, you know, there were scary headlines in the newspapers, NASA's been worried about forward and back contamination for decades. And there's someone that I'm rarely jealous of someone else's job, but I've met a couple of times the NASA holder of the title Planetary Protection Officer, and I just thought, damn, I want that job. That's such a cool job to go to a meeting and say, well, I'm the Planetary Protection Officer. You know, what more do you need to know? So NASA, you know, when we bring the Mars rocks back, we're staging the Mars rocks as we speak from the rover, and probably before the end of the decade, we'll get our Mars rocks back. And nobody really thinks they're extant microbes in them. But I'm glad there's a level 4 biohazard containment facility at Johnson Space Center to handle that, because I'm not sure, you know, Elon Musk, who likes to do things fast and break things, I'm not quite sure he would be up for that. I mean, he might not be interested either. So I think on this major issue of, you know, contact, if you like, and really we're talking about contact with other forms of life that are microbial, you know, the governments will do it carefully. We do, though, have Breakthrough Enceladus. It's a project that is looking to undercut NASA's attempt to go to Enceladus and sample it by order of magnitude on budget, and maybe they can do it, maybe they can't. So the commercial space sector is not as interested in astrobiology per se as finding life on other worlds, microbial life. And if they were, it would be for biotechnology reasons, to possibly find a different template for life that's not the same basis as ours, and be able to do very innovative things in our biology using those tools. But that's very speculative. So I think this is not really, it's not top of mind for most people working in the space sector. The astrobiology work continues, and then as an astronomer, I would say that the most likely first detection of life beyond Earth will be on an exoplanet whose atmosphere has been altered by microbial activity, and we find it through remote sensing and large telescopes. I think that's much more likely than something in the solar system.
Yeah, kind of like the Venus, the Venus little blip where we were all excited for about a week.
Right.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would want to add to this discussion, though, is we also need to be more careful. I'm of the camp that thinks, for example, the Beresheet team should not be allowed to put anything up in orbit or head towards the moon again at all. Like, they should be shut down because they almost contaminated the moon's surface with their tardigrades. That type of recklessness is going to be a problem, and you're going to see it from the private sector, and the governments are going to have to step in and say, no, you can't screw it up for everybody, right? That could have fundamentally messed up lunar possible biological research for the rest of humanity's existence, right? There's no comeback. There's no, oops, I get to do it again, or there's no takeaway. You have to be careful about this. We have to be so careful, because we're talking about something that will change our view of our place in the universe. It is a fundamental human discussion of whether or not we are the only life in the universe. And it's so fundamental to us. Because it's so fundamental to us, we have to be really careful. And people like the Beresheet team, who just were careless in the design of their system, need to feel consequences. And so do other missions. You know, some of the things the Chinese have done on the dark side of the moon have been reckless. And that recklessness needs to be policed at some level from today.
So you both think there is a sort of dialogue at the top of the pyramid?
Well, it's not a very active dialogue because the other issues are more practical and pressing. And an even higher level than what we're talking about, there's an almost philosophical debate, which is, especially in the space science community, over two very competing views of how to do the activity. And this is among scientists. It's not between a scientist and environmentalist, for example. There are many scientists who believe, you know, it's like a national parks model. You should not, you know, alter a pristine environment or any environment. We don't have the right to terraform Mars or seed life on the moon somehow, and when it comes to exoplanets, they're too far away, so it's not an issue. But there are camps that say it's our duty, it's our obligation to expand beyond Earth. Life is special. We are special. It's a very anthropocentric way of thinking, of course. And we almost have an obligation to see if life can take a toehold on a different world, whether it's pristine or used to host life or even currently does underground, they don't care. So these are pretty vigorous debates at just scientific conferences. They haven't risen to the level of policy and governments talking about it particularly, because they've rolled up their sleeves on much more practical issues.
Yeah.
Just to
clarify my position, just to clarify my position, Ricardo, for my part, it's not that I don't think we shouldn't do these things. I just think everything should be intentional. Let's not do it by accident. Let's not screw up and then have to deal with a situation. We've done that enough times, right? You know, everybody, you know, through in American history, people have said that the U.S. Army giving blankets to Native Americans was intentional genocide. It's not clear that was ever the case, but were they careless? Were they reckless in not realizing that they could pass on a disease from the East Coast to people who had no immunity against it because contact had only been made 80 years ago? Right? Those are the consequences we could see. You know, it decimated the Native American population. Sheer carelessness. They were giving out blankets, but they were contaminated with something that other people had an immunity to, right? Now the targeted grades are not going to kill anybody or anything, but again, let's be intentional with what we do. Let's not screw up and then have to go fix it. We've done that enough times as a species.
Well, that's that's what I intended to say when I mentioned that. I mean, the question, when I made the question, are we going to repeat our own mistakes? I mean, that's why I insisted a lot whether there is a sort of dialogue somewhere at the top of the pyramid, because I mean, it could be very, very, very dangerous even for ourselves on Earth if they really bang each other out off Earth. That, for example, I want just to close that. What kind of relationship we can expect between, I mean, talking off Earth, between the different crews, not only from different countries, from different companies as well. What kind of there? I mean, one crew still has some water, the other one has not. Will be any obligation for the one who has water to share it with the others or not? Chris.
I'll pass it to Zaheer. I think he probably has more pertinent comments on this, but I would just say that mostly it'll be very Darwinian, very competitive, uber competitive, but you're in an extremely inhospitable environment. So I suspect there will be some level of resource sharing. There'll be some level of guardianship where if one proto colony has a disastrous rupture in their life support, the rescue will happen from another entity that is ostensibly competing with them. I think they will have to look out for each other. These are very difficult things to do off Earth. And so there'll be a loose and informal network which hopefully steps up when things are really bad. And if that actually happens a few times, that'll build perhaps a slightly uneasy sense of solidarity, but a sense that everyone really is in it sort of together.
So here.
You know, I fundamentally, in many ways, I'll echo Chris. I think, you know, some of the mentality is going to carry forward from the space station, right? You know, I've talked to astronauts, and many astronauts have been asked this question. Look, you're up there with Russians, and we're in the middle of sanctions and invasions and blah blah blah, and you know, they say, well, look, up here we're just humans. You know, that's why, you know, every astronaut is fluent in Russian that has gone to the ISS, because it's in, so I think what's going to happen is you're going to see a certain level of breakdown of ethnocentrism as we go out there. My instinct is that this hyper competitiveness, and I agree with Chris, that Darwinian is going to come more from teams competing for the same resources. Right now, if you're in totally different areas and somebody, you know, air filter blows up and you got a couple spares, you know, it's easy for you to give it to them. But if you're both trying to go, get to the erbium deposit on some crater rim of the moon first, and somebody else's vehicle breaks down and they're stranded, you know, you have a real ethical and moral conundrum. Because, you know, you're contracted to go get that resource. You have $1 trillion on the line, and yet at the same time, the human thing to do is to stop and help them repair their vehicle, right? Which basically restarts the race, and you give up an advantage. So I really think that a lot of these things are not going to necessarily be along national lines, because I think the governments at some level are going to want to try to stay out of the way, right? You know, nuclear powers don't want to get into a conflict that puts them in a position of having to shoot at each other, right? That's a bad idea, right? So we know that. But at the same time, you know, on the commercial side, you know, there will be this discussion. That said, you know, I'm very hopeful personally, because governments do what governments do. Corporations do what corporations do, but people are people. And when you look at the hard times throughout the world, There's also ways people who take advantage of hard times, but there's a greater majority of people who help each other and band together and find a way forward. And I maybe I'm just an optimist, but I do believe and hope that that's what we'll see over time in space. You know, and then again, you can look at the American West, you can look at the expansion into the New World and the way that even competing settlements at you know, would work together, competing wagon trains, etc. Simply to make sure that both of them made it through the winter, for example.
There is a question, and we are going into the last segment of this webinar. And there is a question here that there are popular TV shows and movies like Star Trek that communicate values related to space exploration, human diversity in space, and the idea of not interfering with established culture of species and their development. So the questions are, what are your thoughts about life imitating art in terms of adopting moral values in both humans and AI as we explore and pursue new ways to address human needs? And the second question, are there formal efforts to attract a wide range of people to the multitude of roles that will be required in space? Chris.
Yeah, so quick few comments. As much as I love it and grew up on it, the ethos of Star Trek and its ilk is very idealistic. It's very much of the 60s and 70s. And I don't, I'm not going to get cynical, but I don't think that's going to be the overriding framework necessarily. NASA does its best. NASA has said publicly that a woman of color will set foot on the moon. And I believe that. So NASA is committed to diversity, and so are the government agencies, including in other countries, are paying attention to who gets to do this activity and recognizing that it's a small, very elite group are trying to make it represent their population. So I applaud that, and that's a good thing. But in the other realms, it's going to be very self-selecting. The people, it's a brutal thing to do. The people who are selected for the first self-sustained Mars colony, for example, are going to be, they're just going to be uber geeks. They're going to be prone to hacking their own genome, they're going to be doing things that are really fringy on Earth, but that fit very well that strange, isolated environment. So I don't think you're going to see a mirroring of our global societies in the off-Earth realm for quite a long time.
And Zaheer, do you think there are formal efforts to attract a wide range of people to the multitude of roles that will be required in space? Are we working on that right now?
I'm going to show you something. Yep. I'm going to show you something funny. These are some, there was a series of posters like this from NASA. Whoops, sorry, that you can see.
Yeah.
And including in that were, be a plumber on the moon, be a welder on Mars, because these are really relevant statements, right? The space economy does need the full vertical integration of human capability, right? And one area to look at, for example, in terms of how that works out is Antarctic missions, right? You can have no skill and go to Antarctica because they need chefs. They need people to sweep the floors. That's a reality of sustaining a human colony. The old English phrase, it takes all kinds, right? It takes all kinds. So there is an active effort in America in particular, and I think this is happening we have a problem in that over the last 30 years, politically, vocational education, welding, plumbing, the trades, the crafts, have kind of been looked down upon a little bit. There's been a push to upskill the economy, but the reality is you need all those people and you will need them in space. The skills will be a little different, but that doesn't mean they're not highly skilled. That doesn't mean they don't need great training. So we're going to need them as much as we need the computer scientists, the aerospace engineers, and the other mission specialists, as it were. Particularly as we start to do more and more things that are not self-contained, that are routine, that require maintenance. Within that discussion is, of course, the discussion of AI. And the fact that having a human in space right now is very hard. Life support is 60% of the cost of a mission with humans in it. That's gigantic. That's how much life support costs when you design the system. It's massive. So there's going to be a drive budgetarily to do as much with robotics and AI as possible, right? And because you can't control these in real time from Earth, right? Chris, you're more of the planetary scientist. What is it? 1.5 second one way to the moon at speed of light, something like that. Nominally 1 second, we'll call it, right? In a critical activity, 1 second lag time is not acceptable, right? To Mars, what is it? 5 minutes or something, or 15? I forget what it is. I think it's 5 minutes, right? One way. That's not an acceptable lag. The way we control the rover, if nobody's there with a joystick, somebody's there with a punch card, basically saying going 5 steps forward, 5 steps to the right, then 5 steps forward again, and then drill there, right? That's the way we control that thing. And then you will sit there and wait, and then it gives you feedback, right? So this is going to be a complex mixture that we haven't seen on Earth before, because the drive for autonomy and robotics is going to be so high. But at the same time, fundamentally, you're going to need doctors, you're going to need cooks, you're going to need everything that we need on Earth out there. And so all those people will have to become civilian astronauts. And there are companies and programs that are working on how do we think about training them? How do we think about what they'll be able to do? How do we cross-train and all those questions that arise thereof?
Sorry, go ahead.
Just a quick add-on. And I think we will also need, back to that issue of regulation and rules, but we'll need, whether it's trade unions or the equivalent of OSHA in the United States for health and safety at work, we'll need some of that, because otherwise it's, Antarctica is an unfortunate example because it's just been exposed as a place of rampant sexual harassment in that isolated community. And so these things are not going to happen organically or naturally. Sally Ride died and never came out as gay because that was unacceptable in the astronaut corps, in her view, back then. So this lags a little. And so you almost have to be proactive in putting something in place that will protect the weaker, the less able, the lower performing people out there. Everyone's going to be high performing. There's just going to be a bunch of alpha humans out there, which actually probably very,
well, the team admixture, right? The psychology is a big deal, right, Chris? Because we know that that's not going to work when you have to live for 20 years or something, right? The longest anybody stayed on the station is what was it Kelly with his 1 year, or was it somebody else up there for 13 or 14 months?
It was 820 days of Russian.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. But still, fundamentally, like you said, they're all alphas. That's going to turn into a dogfight at some point.
Sorry, guys.
That psychology mixture is a big deal.
Sorry, guys, but I somehow, some way, I think, and I'm sorry about saying this, but I think that there are two development speed. I mean, the development speed of exploration of space is not the same speed that the terrestrial institutions have. And the gap between two speeds is too big, too much. But there is another question here, more, I mean, to have fun, we take a flight to the space. Chris mentioned that he wanted to do it, and I think you, Zaheer, would like to do it, and myself.
Absolutely.
We can go, all of us, I mean, the three of us, we can go there, but there's a question: how can you protect from cosmic rays there? I mean,
well, I think once you're on the trip to Mars, you'll take 3 times your lifetime radiation exposure in the 8 or 9 months it takes to get there, and that doesn't boost your chances of cancer by more than 5 or 8%. It's not dramatic. It's not the biggest risk of that trip, let's put it that way. we know in situ resource utilization technologies are very mature now, and they're not even that high tech. They're just electrochemical basically. And those will provide a way to protect in a harsh radiation environment like Mars. So you won't be living in a nice glass dome staring out at the beautiful landscape. You'll be in a hardened shell with the lunar regolith turned into slump block, a foot thick all around you. So I think those risks, the radiation risks, actually pale compared to the other risks of catastrophic loss of the transport vehicle or the habitat itself, or possibly the human catastrophe that might take place potentially.
Excellent. And Zaheer, which kind of education would or do you need or do they need for mineral exploration? What kind and what country is any country doing this? I mean, already?
I mean, a lot of countries are planning it. A lot of regions are planning it. I was just recently talking to Oscar Garcia, who's out of Texas, in the Midland Odessa region, and that's a very strong region in its skill base for resource capture. Right? It's oil country, and it's not only oil country; it's wildcatting country. Meaning, these are the guys who are out there figuring out how to get resources out of things like shale and whatnot, the hard stuff, not the stuff where you stick a straw in the ground and oops, there comes the black gold. So there are nations that have an advantage. Countries like Saudi Arabia, America, Canada, Australia, tremendous skill in mining, certainly China, and those skills, it's going to be about taking people who understand how to do that, and then also taking people who understand how to work and do things in space. And then the third leg of that tripod is going to be the business people and the economists to create the business models to make this worth investment in. I promise nobody, I didn't pay Ricardo to toss me that question. This question is literally why I created the degree at ASU Thunderbird for space business management and leadership and policy, because that is a question that's pressing in this time. And it's not just technical skills. That's the one thing I want to say really strongly. Chris and I are both physicists by training, or astronomer and physicist by training. Originally I took the management lobotomy, more than a decade ago, but I'm still a scientist at heart. It's not just people like us. It needs the marketers. It needs the welders, but it also needs the marketing professionals. It needs the guys who are going to do the accounting. It needs, the folks who are going to be out there running operations. So really, any type of education you have is going to be relevant to the space economy. The question is, can you put your space hat on? Can you learn enough about the space economy to make that skill relevant into that economy? Because it is a shift. It's a pivot. Just like you move from mining to medical to social media and marketing, for example, right? There's a lot of transferable skills, but you also have to go understand something about the domain you're working in.
There's a question specifically for you, Chris. Milton says that you describe space as a pristine environment for development of materials and even medicine, but it isn't space polluted by sources of electromagnetic fields, gamma, UV, IR, and other rays? Isn't industry and even workers better protected by Earth's atmosphere?
Well, yes and no. It depends what you're trying to do. We know that the commercial aspirations for the space station never manifested. Companies did not flock to it to do drug manufacture and testing and so on. I mean, the cost model was ruinous, basically. But in the future, when the cost model is more advantageous, I think the advantages of the space environment relative to an Earth environment are that, by pristine, I essentially mean you can work in vacuum and zero gravity. And that combination, where it's fairly easy to shield from radiation, that's really not a hard thing to do, provides some very interesting opportunities, because much manufacture now operates at the level of requirements of extreme purity of materials, extreme small quantities being combined as sort of nano manufacturing essentially. And doing that robotically or in space, in that, again, in the combination of vacuum and zero gravity, is going to provide things that you just can't do on Earth. It's just impossible to do on Earth. There will indeed be some things that it's always better to do on the Earth.
Zaheer, for you, blockchain Web 3 provides way to moderate economy in space, according to the person that made this comment and question. The key is also wealth creation on Earth as a result of activities in space and democratization of ownership of space assets. These are principles of design we did for space. It's an organization, and successfully drive its implementation while sponsoring research and progressive economic space thought, economy and livelihood in space. What do you think about blockchain Web 3 providing way to moderate the economy in space?
I think they're good ideas. I certainly think that we're going to see those applications come to bear on Earth. For example, I recently sold a house. If that could have been done via Web3 and blockchain smart contracts, it would have probably saved me 40 hours of my life. So there are tremendous applications for those technologies. But the reality is there's a reason real estate is called real estate. It's real. Nothing in the computer is real. People can argue that with me all I want, but I tell you what, I'm an experimental physicist, and if I can't blow it up or break it, it's not real. And that's the reality of the world, right? And the same thing is going to happen in space. We can plan for organization and logic until somebody picks up a tool and smashes somebody else in the head over a claim, right? And you go, again, you go back to other parts of human history. Now it's going to take a lot more to get that wrench out there and to get that argument, but fundamentally, unless there is a regime in which we have a way to interact with different countries, corporations in different countries. For example, Angola never signed the Outer Space Treaty. It can go do whatever it wants, and we have no international regime by which to hold it accountable. So if you are a billionaire and you want to go start a company and just do whatever you want in space, you register your company under Angola's flag, and you go full on Wild West. That can happen. How are we going to enforce? Are we going to then invade Angola to get them to enforce law on this person? Or are we just going to send Space Force troops to say, sorry, buddy, you don't get to do this. We're going to blow up, we're just going to commandeer your stuff, and you're getting the heck out of, Serenity Basin before you trample on Neil's footprints. Sorry. So Web 3.0 and blockchain aren't going to solve that. No digital technology is. That's going to happen by diplomacy. It's going to happen via negotiation, and it's going to happen by an ability to enforce. No law matters unless there's an ability to enforce it and the expectation that it will be enforced. And that type of regime currently does not exist.
I have to switch to a little bit to Chris for you are on the advisory council of MERI, the Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And besides asking you what kind of activities does this institution carry out, there is a second question about what do you think about, and this is for both of you. The first one is about MERI. What kind of activities you carry out there?
I mean, it's a modest activity that involves astrobiologists, and it's a very interdisciplinary group of people, includes philosophers and sociologists and communication specialists and mathematicians. So the idea is that the passive search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, has been going since 1960 and has not succeeded yet, and is continuing. The messaging is different. It's only been tried a couple of times in the past half century, and it's the idea of just signaling to potential intelligent civilizations something that represents us or humanity or the Earth in some way. It's an informal activity, and it's not being done. It's being done with an awareness that no group of scientists, especially a small group, has any right to speak for all humanity. So that's not intended or implied. It's also it's really an intellectual experiment for the most part, because it doesn't have any real practical import. The targets for messaging are, hundreds to thousands of light years away. So we're talking about, civilization timescales before your message is even received. So I prefer to view it as a sort of a very pure sort of hypothetical experiment that encourages us to think about ourselves in a particular way and in a sort of unifying way, because what is a message that you would send that represents all of humanity? There's very little that we do that represents all of us.
And what would be that message?
Well, people have come up with different things. The history of it is to use little pictograms, which you've turned into pixels and then into binary signals that you beam out with radio telescopes. And that's still a major mode of doing it. You can do it with pulse lasers as well. So optical SETI and radio SETI have their analogs in the messaging activity. But you're making a lot of assumptions. So I'll be the first to say that METI is always on the edge of anthropocentric thinking, of the danger of doing something that is so posited in our existence and our culture and our language and our human attributes that it's not got any universality at all, even if biology is universal, which it may well be.
And Zaheer, what do you think? And this is it was a sort of inevitable question today. What do you think about human beings' testimonies in contact with, according to themselves, extraterrestrials' experiences here? Have you had any? I mean, what do you think in general terms? What do you think? Honestly, what do you think about all these comments and testimonies and?
While I can't say that it's impossible, I would say it's extremely improbable. I'll give the typical quantum physicist answer, right? The probability is non-zero, but it's very, very low that such a thing would occur. And the reasons are simply that the technological capability that would be represented by the ability to stealthily travel faster than the speed of light, because really that's what it would take, to interact with a human from another planet. At some level, one would infer that their civilization would have evolved beyond, kind of nincompoop Hollywood tactics. Right, and that's what most of these stories come to. Now, there are some people who seem extremely credible, and one has to wonder if what they are talking about is not some sort of hacked way of trying to get fame, but actually something that is related to their mental health, because they're credible, they're completely believable, and they don't seem crazy, as it were, right? But we know from a lot of different research that false memories, internalized trauma, and all those things exist, and are human reactions to certain situations. So, but at the same time, I still, and maybe it's just my, he was my hero as a boy. I still think of the Carl Sagan book and not bad, not perfect, but not bad movie Contact, where if these things happen, they're going to be done in a certain way. What I really think is that it's a waste of my time to spend too much time thinking about it. And I know that sounds harsh, but the reality is that there's so much to do in space now that has nothing to do with ET, or any of that stuff, right? We have amazing, I know the folks at SETI very well, and they're amazing people, and they're doing great work. And I believe they should be continue to be funded and to be able to do that work, because it's a human need to go do that search. But at the same time, we can help solve energy crises by building space-based solar arrays. So let's go do that, right? We can stop a war. World War III is likely to be fought over water or rare earth metals. So let's prevent that by going and getting an asteroid that has more nickel than anybody on Earth has ever seen. Those are the things we should spend our time doing, spend our time thinking about, and not worry about gobbledygook, because it's just irrelevant. There's things we can solve for humanity now, today, using space. And my preference is to spend my time and mental energy focused on those.
That's an excellent comment. And very hopeful. I really personally like it. And what do you think? What do you think, Chris, about this? People who say that they have been in contact or whatever. I mean, extraterrestrial experiences.
I'm never going to discount someone's claimed personal experience. That would be arrogant or presumptuous. But I agree totally with Zaheer. It's just a question of what you spend your time on. Most astronomers very reluctant to get pulled into the realm of UFOs, and especially contact, abduction, and so on. Not because there might not be a kernel of truth somewhere in there. And of course, if there were, isn't that incredible and important? Yes. But because the signal to noise, just to be nerdy about it, the signal to noise ratio of this is very low. Because it's bound up, as we know, it's bound up in just crazy conspiracy theories. And there are too many parts of our modern life that are webs of conspiracy theories. So this is just a flavor of them. And it's just not a fruitful thing for most professional scientists to engage in. And they don't even have to judge it per se to make that statement. That's just a pragmatic statement of how you spend your time, just as Zaheer said.
I would say that it is more, we are in a hurry to solve many things here on Earth, and we could do through the space exploration. And as Zaheer said, I mean, the nickel or whatever, I mean, rare materials. Yeah. And I hope that that's the way we are going to, that's the goal we are going to attain.
And if I were just making one slightly snarky, humorous comment, as alluding to crop circles, some of which are supposed to be done by aliens, I just think a priori it's slightly implausible that a highly technological civilization, more advanced than us by definition, would travel hundreds of trillions of miles to press down our wheat and then go back.
And you mentioned some conspiracy theories, and I would say that something that it's very doubtful is that the beauty contest, Miss Universe, organized on Earth, is always won by a terrestrial.
That's a conspiracy. 100%.
That's conspiracy.
It's like the World Series, right? But only only America and one Canadian team play.
So there's a comment here. We are already working with leaders in commercial moon missions. It is happening right now. And according to the comment here, it's a person, she's a person, it's an investor, a co-founder, billionaires are included, whatever. They create also economic laws. And this is a start to creating an order, a general order. And I think it's a good comment. I mean, I don't know whether you agree or not. There are some other questions, but coming up, but we are on time, and we promised ourselves to be punctual, and we have 1 minute to go. And I would like us to ask you, both of you, if you had to send a message, not outer space, to mankind, to people here on Earth, about the human exploration of space, what your message would be, Chris?
I would say that it seems to many to be an expensive sideshow, a frill, a frippery. But I think you need to take the long view and be patient. This is wound up with the future of humanity writ large. And if we don't really destroy ourselves and the planet, then I think this is our future.
Zaheer?
Yeah, no, and you know, just to, again, thank you to the attendees. Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you, Chris. It's an honor to be on here with you and Ricardo. You know, just to close, I would echo Chris, but I would be a bit sharper, and I think you guys realize that's my personality by now. We don't have a choice. Okay, we don't have a choice. Yes, the Earth, by calculation, could support 12 billion people and feed them. But we know that we can't solve world hunger now with 7 billion. We have to go because expansion is, while there have been horrible things like what happened in the New World to the indigenous people, at the same time, expansion to areas of greater resource availability has always led to a raising of the floor of human experience and civilization. We go not for ourselves, but for every generation that comes after. And if people don't understand this, then I think they need to come talk to people like you, Ricardo, come talk to people like Chris, come talk to me, and we'll outline every massive benefit that your life depends on that is based on space and what we've done in space. The laptop, the cell phone, everything you take for granted was developed for the space use case. Energies are going to be developed for that. So we don't have a choice. I just tell everybody, get on board, join us. We need you. We need your skill. We need your perspective. We need your intelligence, because if we're going to do this, it's literally going to take all of us. No one human, not Elon, not Jeff, can ever save the species by going to space. It's going to take humanity to do it. So I would just say the door's open. Get on board.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a good food for thought today. Thank you so much, Professor Christopher Impey, Professor Zaheer Ali. Thank you so much for your, your thoughts, your explanations, and especially not only your knowledge, your imagination and your hopes. Thank you so much, and keep doing that, please.
It's been a pleasure, and thanks to all of those who joined us and asked such great questions.
Goodbye to everybody. Thank you to the audience, and thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.
Cheers. Be well.